Picture this. It's 1970. Gas is cheap, the Vietnam War is on the nightly news, and Detroit's Big Three are locked in an arms race, not with tanks, but with horsepower. Shiny new muscle cars prowl the streets, each one louder, faster, and meaner than the last. But behind the chrome smiles and glossy brochures, a secret war is being fought. A war of numbers, because those horsepower ratings printed in magazines, they were often a lie. The late 60s and early 70s were the golden age of American horsepower. Every kid wanted a Camaro, a Mustang, a Roadrunner, or a GTO. But there was a problem, two problems actually. Insurance companies had begun cracking down, jacking up rates for high-horsepower cars, while racing sanctioning bodies like the NHRA and SCCA classified vehicles based on factory-stated horsepower. That meant the number on paper didn't just influence bragging rights, it determined whether you could afford to insure your car and whether your team could win at the drag strip. So automakers developed a clever trick, underreporting horsepower. Engines that made 400, 425, even 450 horsepower on the dyno were quietly listed as 366, 375, or 390, a harmless stretch of the truth. Hardly. This was a deliberate cover-up, an entire industry conspiracy. And the public had no idea, but the insiders knew. Engineers, racers, and anyone with access to a dyno sheet could see the truth. Detroit was feeding America a steady diet of horsepower lies. To understand the horsepower cover-up, you have to know how engines were rated in the first place. During the 1960s, manufacturers used what was called gross horsepower. That meant engines were tested on a dynamometer with no accessories attached, no alternator, no power steering pump, not even an exhaust system. It was a best-case scenario, a number that looked impressive in ads but didn't reflect real-world conditions. But here's where the twist comes in. Even with that inflated testing method, manufacturers still chose to underrate certain engines. Why? Because a high number could be dangerous, financially. A car rated at 425 horsepower would send your insurance premium through the roof. Worse, racing bodies like the NHRA would throw your car into a tougher class, pitting you against machines you had no chance of beating. So Detroit cooked the books. Take the legendary 1970 Chevrolet Chevelle SS454 LS6. Officially, Chevy claimed 450 horsepower. Impressive, sure, but dyno tests routinely showed closer to 500. Some say even 525. This was no honest mistake. Chevy knew full well the LS6 was a beast. But on paper, it was reined in, domesticated, hidden behind a number that wouldn't scare insurers or race officials. Then there was Chrysler's 426 Hemi, the elephant motor. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, this engine was a monster in NASCAR and on the drag strip. Yet real-world output was often 470, 480, even 500 horses in showroom trim. Chrysler's own engineers admitted the truth. We told the insurance companies one thing, but the cars were delivering much more. Pontiac was guilty too. The 1969 Ram Air 4 400 cubic inch V8 was rated at 370 horsepower. But anyone who drove one could feel it. It was stronger than Pontiac's own 428 rated at 390. Independent dynos later proved it. The Ram Air 4 was closer to 410 or 420 horsepower. The numbers just didn't add up. Oldsmobile's 455W30 was listed at 370 horsepower. Yet those who strapped one to a dyno often saw over 430. The torque, a staggering 500 pound-feet, enough to shred tires in seconds. But again, the brochure kept it modest. This wasn't a one-off mistake. It was a pattern. A factory-wide strategy across GM, Chrysler, and even Ford. Advertise a number that looked believable, one that kept the heat off, while quietly unleashing far more power than anyone expected. And here's the kicker. Buyers loved it. Because when you dropped the hammer, the car felt even faster than the spec sheet promised. It was like discovering a hidden bonus, a secret only muscle car drivers got to enjoy. On the street, the deception turned every stoplight into a guessing game. Numbers in brochures no longer told the truth. A car listed at 366 horsepower could suddenly pull away from one rated at 400. Bragging rights shifted from magazines to the quarter mile. It created a strange paradox. The less horsepower a car was rated for on paper, the more dangerous it often was in reality. Take the 1970 LS6 Chevelle. Officially, it was a 450 horsepower car. But in real-world quarter-mile runs, it was pulling low 13s, sometimes high 12s, at trap speeds of 108 to 112 miles per hour. Those numbers lined up with engines making well over 500 horsepower. Meanwhile, Chrysler's 426 Hemi, rated at just 425 horsepower, was running similar times. Drivers joked that Chrysler must have misplaced 100 horses somewhere because the Elephant stomped nearly everything it faced. Even mid-tier engines showed the same trickery. Pontiac's Ram Air-Fuel GTO and Trans Am were consistently quicker than higher-rated rivals. Oldsmobile's 455 W30 was famous for its tire-shredding launches, despite being underrated by at least 50 horsepower. And then came the track. In drag racing, horsepower wasn't just bragging rights, it was the law. The NHRA used factory ratings to classify cars into competition brackets. So if a car was listed at 425 horsepower instead of the true 480, it could sneak into an easier class and dominate. That's exactly what happened. Engineers at Detroit's big automakers quietly sandbagged their own numbers to give factory-backed racers a leg up. Ford, GM, and Chrysler all played the game. Even AMC joined the party, rating their wild 390s and 401s lower than reality to keep their cars competitive. It was a chess match, a shadow war fought not with horsepower but with the illusion of horsepower. But the deception spread far beyond the track. On the street, young buyers were tricked into thinking they were beating the system. You'd walk into a dealership, sign the paperwork for a modest 370 horsepower Pontiac, only to discover you'd bought a 420 horsepower monster. Insurance agents, meanwhile, were left scratching their heads. Why were 366 horsepower cars demolishing their higher-rated competitors in real-world crashes and claims? By the early 70s, the scam was so widespread that companies simply started flagging any car with a big engine, no matter what the brochure said. But like all good conspiracies, the horsepower cover-up couldn't last forever. Because lurking on the horizon was a storm, emissions regulations, the oil crisis, and the end of the muscle car era as everyone knew it. By 1971, the walls were closing in. The horsepower cover-up, once a clever trick to outsmart insurers and racing officials, was becoming harder to maintain. Insurance companies had caught on. They weren't fooled by the brochure anymore. Instead of basing premiums strictly on advertised horsepower, they began targeting cars by cubic inches, performance packages, and even model names. You owned a Chevelle SS? A Plymouth GTX? A Pontiac GTO? Congratulations, you were paying through the nose no matter what the paperwork claimed. At the same time, Washington was turning up the heat. New federal emissions regulations, beginning in 1970, forced manufacturers to choke back their engines with lower compression ratios and restrictive exhaust systems. The days of 11-1 compression and leaded high-octane fuel were numbered. Suddenly, the monster motors of yesterday had to be tamed. And then, in 1972, the bomb dropped. Manufacturers abandoned the old gross horsepower standard and switched to the more realistic net horsepower system. Instead of testing engines in idealized conditions, stripped bare on a dyno, they now measured output with all accessories installed, exhaust systems attached, and under real-world conditions. The result? Numbers plummeted overnight. A car that had proudly boasted 370 horsepower in 1971 might be rated at just 280 in 1972, even if it was the exact same engine. To the average buyer, it looked like Detroit's muscle cars had been neutered. Fans felt betrayed. The glory days of hidden horsepower were gone, replaced with smaller numbers and shrinking engines. The cover-up, once thrilling, had turned sour. What began as a way to game the system ended as proof that the party was over. But here's the twist. Those lower net horsepower ratings, introduced in 1972, were often more honest than the inflated gross numbers of the 1960s. For the first time in years, buyers were actually seeing figures closer to what their cars delivered on the street. The era of horsepower lies had ended, but its legacy was burned into the pavement. The horsepower cover-up may have ended with the switch to net ratings and the tightening grip of regulations, but its legend never died. In fact, It became one of the most enduring myths of the muscle car era. Even today, enthusiasts still gather at car shows, arguing over what the numbers really were. Was the LS6 Chevelle actually a 500-horsepower monster? Did Chrysler's Hemi push 500 on pump gas? Could Pontiac's underrated Ram Air Y4 have embarrassed the big blocks in its day? The truth is, dyno tests from restorers and collectors have confirmed much of what the whispers claimed. Engines rated at 370 or 425 in the brochures consistently make 30, 40, sometimes even 60 horsepower more on modern equipment. The lies of yesterday have been exposed by the science of today. And maybe that's why the cover-up still fascinates us. Because it wasn't just about cheating insurers or tricking racing officials. It was about magic, the magic of stepping into a car that felt stronger than the world said it should be. You weren't just buying a GTO, a Hemi Cuda, or a Chevelle SS. You were buying a secret, a factory-kept mystery, a hidden promise that your car carried more power than anyone admitted. Some call it deception, others call it genius. But either way, it cemented the muscle car era as a time when cars weren't just machines. They were legends. Legends with numbers that never told the whole story. The horsepower cover-up wasn't just a trick. It was an era-defining scandal. And even now, decades later, we're still chasing the truth behind those lies printed in black and white. So here's the question. Which muscle car do you think was the most underrated of them all? Was it the LS6 Chevelle, the Chrysler Hemi, the Pontiac Ram Air 4, or something else entirely? Drop your answer in the comments. Let's settle the debate once and for all. And if you enjoyed uncovering the secrets of Detroit's horsepower lies, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more hidden stories of the muscle car era, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because in the world of classic cars, sometimes the biggest stories aren't the ones in the ads, but the ones they tried to hide.